Welcome to the tutorial video for the Rover Candidacy project. This will be Fusion 360 computer-aided design using Fusion 360. So this will be a video with some intermediate techniques and some refreshers. This should not be your first video. We're going to take a look at some steering geometry. That's the example we're going to use to look at some things. So if we pull this up on Google, we've used a system called Ackerman steering, where the front wheels turn at different radiuses. That helps you corner better. The inside wheel has to turn a sharper circle since it's closer to the center than the outside wheel. So there's a simple approximation. It's not perfect, but there's a simple approximation where you can have your steering pivot joints lined up with your kingpin joints, and then I'll go back here to your back axle. So to kind of explain some of this geometry, we're going to go ahead and design it in CAD. If you're interested, you can Google it and find all sorts of videos and instructional things that tell you more about the idea, but right now we're just going to focus on CAD. If you've got questions about Fusion 360, the Autodesk Design Academy is a great resource. It's got some beginner, some intermediate, and some advanced tutorials. One of the things we'll be covering is what they mentioned right here, rule number 1, and that's just some structure and some organization. We'll also look at parameters, how to name and save different components with a purpose so people know what you're talking about and how you save your project files. We'll look at the sweep tool, and then we'll also look at some joints. We'll do a motion study, the difference between joints and a rigid group, some section analysis, and then the component cycle. Right now we'll jump into our CAD project. If I open up my Candidacy pane, open up my data panel, you guys will be working in the 2019 Rover files and in the 2019 Candidacy. You'll create a folder with your own work, and that's where you'll do your stuff. I'm going to do mine in my folder. And we're going to go ahead, I'm going to walk you through how to create some components for a basic rover. The good thing with the Ackerman, if I change my view and we look at the steering, I've got this set up that as I change the tie rod, that's how we usually steer the rover, you can see that the inside wheel turns a little bit more. And if that's not clear, I can turn on the joints and you can see these angles. The angles for the inside wheels, 30 and 32, are greater than the angles for the outside wheel. So the inside wheels need to turn a little bit sharper just so that it steers better. In this video will help describe, and in subsequent videos will help describe how to create a CAD model with those kind of properties. So I'll just revert this back and leave this. We'll save it. So we'll start with a new design. Rule number 1 just talks about structure and organization, and the idea behind it is just to keep your timeline and all your folders organized. So I'm just going to go ahead, and even though there's nothing in there, I'm going to save this. As a candidacy project for DMC, and that would be yours truly. So now that I've got my folder saved, up here it's got a title. I'm going to go ahead and right click and do new component. That's going to create a new component with all the subfolders I need, and it's also going to activate that component. That is going to help us in a great way keep things organized. So we're going to do some main structure of the rover. We're going to start with this front main beam and the front cross beam, the rear main, and the rear cross beam. So we're going to design those 4 pieces. So we'll come over here. We want to try to use parameters as much as we can. So I'm going to click on user parameters. I'm going to type in FMB for the front main beam. We'll have that be 48 inches long. I'm also going to add parameter for the front cross beam, and we'll leave that as 48 as well. A lot of times on our past rovers, that front cross beam has been smaller than the rear cross beam, but just for our purposes, we'll leave everything the same. The rear main beam, we'll leave that as 48 inches as well. And same thing for the rear cross beam. We'll leave that as 48 inches. I can go in any time and change these parameters. I'm also going to add a tube width. We've been using square tube. It's usually 1 inch wide. And then the tube height is 2 inches. We've been using 1x2 square tube. I'm not going to bother putting the wall thickness in for this video, but we can use those later if we need to. So now I've got my component here. I'm going to go ahead and sketch on this front plane. I'm going to do a center rectangle right there on the origin. I'm going to type in TW for tube width, tab over TH for tube height, hit enter twice, and instead of just being numbers, these are functions because they're defined as parameters. Go ahead and stop this sketch. I can either click my profile, right click and do press, pull, or extrude, or I can start the extrude tool from up here and select my profile. This way is me the negative direction. So I'm going to say negative front main beam because we defined that to be 48 inches. We'll create that and kind of zoom out to see that. The next thing I'm going to do is come up here. I'm going to activate the main component, and I'm going to right click and do the same thing. Following rule number 1 is to make sure you always right click and do a new component from the main top level design. So new component. I'm going to create my sketch plane. It's going to be on this sketch plane over here, but I want to draw it down at this end. This time I'll do a 2-point rectangle. And same thing, I want to do tube height as 2 inches and my tube width as 1 inch. Hit enter to put those in. I'll stop the sketch. This time, instead of just extruding out of one direction, I'll just click this and right click. I'm going to do the press pull, and the press pull will open up the extrude. Instead of doing one side, I'm going to do symmetric on both sides. The measurement can do the half length or the whole length. I want to do the whole length. That's the variable that I put in, and that will be the front cross beam. Go ahead and OK. Go back up to my main component, and now I've got these two components. So instead of just leaving these as components, if I just do a slow left click and click twice, we can name these. And this is part of what I was talking about as far as being more structured and more organized. And instead of just calling those all the main components and just leaving them as untitled or just component 1, 2, 3, 4, I'm going to go ahead and name these things so that other users will know what we're talking about. Okay, so I'm up here at the main level. I'm going to right click, create a new component again. I'm going to sketch. I'm going to go, I don't want to sketch it exactly at the end of that beam. I want to scoot it up a little bit. So instead of using this plane, I need another plane just offset a little bit. So I'll offset. Got to turn my origin back on. I'm going to take this plane. I'm just going to offset it an inch. And that's all I'm going to need. So now I've got two planes there. And when I do my sketch, I can select either the origin plane or I can go ahead and select that offset plane. These pieces are kind of in my way, so I'll turn off the visibility. And now I can do the same thing that I did before. I'm going to create a center rectangle right there, and I want to do tube height. Tab over to do tube width. Hit enter to lock those in. So this time, and if I go up here to the right hand side and go to fit to get that back into view, you can see that this plane is offset from the origin plane. If I come up a little bit, that's kind of hard to see. But this is the normal plane, and this one is offset to the right a little bit. And it's kind of zoomed in. But I'll select this profile, press pull that. That's going to open up the extrude command for me. This time I want one-sided. I'm going to go a distance, and this is going to be my rear main beam. And it'll kind of fill that in for you. Hit OK. So that's my rear main beam. We'll go ahead and name that. We'll turn the light bulb on these other guys so we can see the visibility. When these are not active, you can see the a transparent version of them, semi-transparent. Now they're all active. I've got my origin on, so I'll go ahead, right-click, new component. We'll go ahead and call this rear crossbeam. And we'll go ahead and sketch this. I'm going to do it on this plane. This is right down the center of those channels. I'll zoom in over here. I'll do the 2-point rectangle. Attach it up there. Same thing, tube height, tube width. Okay. Oh, and it didn't, the tube height, or the tube width should be measured on there as well. I don't know if I didn't type it in. We'll say tube width. Click. There we go. So I can see those functions. So we'll go ahead and stop that sketch. I like to be back in the isometric, the kind of perspective view when I extrude things, just so I can see which way I'm going. I'm just going to right click that profile, press pull. I'm going to go back to symmetric, the whole length, and this is going to be the rear crossbeam. And as you're going, it'll give you options of the rear crossbeam or the rear main beam, because those are the parameters that I've already entered. So I can just go ahead and click that, or I can type it. So I've got all 4 ports of my frame built. This is going to be the basis of our chassis. And this looks great. I kind of sketched everything, designed everything where I wanted it. But if I go ahead and grab any one of these pieces, none of these things are grounded, and none of them are fixed right now. So I'm going to go back and revert. I'm going to put them back where they were. And there's 2 ways you can do this. You can come up here to assemble. Let me select these 2 things first. The front main beam. I'm going to hold down Shift and select both of those. Do assemble. I'm going to create a rigid group. Those 2 components are selected. I'm going to hit OK. And now these 2 things will move as one thing. They're a rigid group. It creates them as a joint, but it doesn't have the joint marker on here. I think it looks a little bit cleaner. Sometimes you're going to need to use joints. Sometimes if you're going to import another assembly and you just want everything to stay put, you can use a rigid group. For this back one, we'll go ahead and do a as-built joint. I was careful when I designed this and I placed it exactly where I want it. So for my as-built joint, I can select one component and the second component. I don't want these 2 things to revolve. I want them to stay rigid. So that's where the joint icon comes in there. And I usually turn these off just so they don't get in the way. And then we're going to ground one of these. We'll go ahead, right click, and we'll ground the front main beam. So this one will stay put. This one is still able to be moved. I'm going to revert and put it back. In some years we've got a pivot to the Rover. Last year in Phoenix we didn't, but I'll go ahead and design a pivot. This is where we're going to get into the sweep tool. This may be something that you haven't used before. So I'm going to be working off of this component right here, my rear main beam. So I'm going to go ahead and activate that. And then I need to do a sketch. So I'm going to create a sketch on this plane right here, and that's in the middle of that beam. I'm going to come in here and do an arc, center point arc. If I leave my mouse still, it says place the center point. We'll do it right there at the corner. The next thing it says is specify the start point. So we'll just come back 1 inch, and then we'll come around 90 degrees, and that's our end point. right click and hit OK to end the arc tool. I'll grab the line tool and I'll come down here, make sure it's vertical, and we'll go 4 inches. Let me type that in. So I could define a parameter for that, but at this point we're not going to worry about it. So we'll stop the sketch. So now I've got that line, curved line kind of coming out and coming along that way. We're going to make another sketch, and this time I'm going to use the side of this beam as my sketch face. That dot's not on my sketch, but I can still use it for reference. I'm going to go ahead and do the center rectangle. I'm going to start it on that dot. Tube width, hopefully you can see this coming now. Tube height, lock those in. So now I've got that rectangle. This is our standard square tubing, and it's kind of plastered on the side of that beam. Okay. Oh, and you know what? I think I did. No, that's good. That's where my arc starts right there. So I'm going to stop that sketch. So now I've got this profile, and I've got this line coming out from the center of the profile. So this is where the sweep tool is pretty cool. It will take this profile and it's going to kind of extrude it, not in a straight line, but it's going to extrude it around this bend. So I'm going to come over here to the profile. I'm going to select the path. That's why I made that line, and I can extrude this any distance along that line that I want to. So you can get some pretty cool shapes. It's a pretty interesting geometry. This line does not have to be straight. That's an arc in a straight line, but this profile can be as interesting or as crazy as you need it or want it to be. My operation over here is join. It's going to join this component to that component. I want it to be its own thing. So I'll come over here to new component. Say OK. So now inside this rear main beam, you can see that's got an assembly. If I click down on here, there's component 5.1, and then there's going to be the main beam, which is the whole thing. So it kind of added those two together. I did this component inside of this main one. We're going to need one of these for the other side. So I can come over here. I can either copy this and kind of rotate it over there, or I'm just going to come over here to create a mirror. And instead of, I'm going to use the feature. A lot of times it's on faces or bodies. But I'm going to do features. I'm going to come down here and select this sweep tool. My mirror plane will be right there in the center. And now I've got one on the exact opposite side. So there's that, and then that's mirror. Okay, the last thing we need to do is I'm going to drill a hole in here so we can make this a pivot. So I'll come back and I'll sketch on the side of this face. I want to get this midpoint, so I'm going to grab a line. As I come down, when it turns into a triangle like that, it means it's the midpoint of whatever line you're on. So I'm going to come out here perpendicular. It doesn't matter length. I'm going to right click to say OK. I'm going to turn this into a construction line. But since this is defined as the midpoint of this line, if I change the height of my tubing, this line will stay at my midpoint. And this dot, I can't move it up or down, but I can move it side to side because I didn't specify that distance. And since we're just kind of playing around, we'll just leave it right there. If I need to come back and specify it, I will. So we'll put just a 1/2 inch circle right there. Put a little dimension on that so we can see it, that it's 1/2 inch. And stop that sketch. So I can take this, grab that profile, press pull, and we can do lots of cool things. I can go in, right now it's trying to do a new body, and I actually want it to cut. So it's going to cut through this piece, it'll cut through that other piece, and it'll cut all the way through the other piece if I let it. It'll cut through all three of those. So for the distance, I can either specify a distance and make sure I get through everything. I can go to an object. If I left click and hold, I can select the top face, or what I really want is that far face, even though I can't see it. Fusion will allow me to select that, and it's going to cut through all the way to that face. So if I move it, that face, if I make the square tubing any thicker, it'll go there. Or I can also just cut through all, and it'll just go through everything. But I'd like this going to the object, so we'll go ahead and do that, and click OK. So even though this was not selected, it still modified that geometry. And if we take a peek through here, we can see that that hole went through all three pieces, even the piece that was not active. So now I'll come back out to my main component, clear that up. This piece is grounded, so now when I create a joint, we've done rigid groups, we've done as built, so now let's do a normal joint. Component 1 will be this one. Component 2, let me select, so sorry, I want to select the I need to select one of these coins that I'm going to use to make my joints with, but I really need a coin that's going to match up with that coin there in the middle. So let me see if I can move this around. And it's not really going to give me a coin where I want it. So if it's not going to be nice, I built this with the hole going through both of them, so I can do the as-built joint. So components, we'll do this one and this one. I don't want these to be rigid, I want them to revolve. So now it's going to ask me, though I wanted to select it to rotate around. So now I can grab this cylinder. And it only rotates the one component when you hit the animate, but these two, once I click out of this, those two will go with it. So I'll hit OK. This is the part that is grounded, so it won't move. This is a part of the rigid group, so it won't move. What if I come back here and grab this? Then that'll go ahead and move wherever I need it to. I'll revert out of there. So now I'm going to save this. I'm going to save this. You can always just hit user saved if you really haven't made any significant changes or there's nothing really going on. But I'm going to write down in here that I did the frame and the joints. Hit OK. And that's going to be helpful. Come back over here to our data panel. This is the one that I'm working on right now. And I can see that 19 minutes ago I created the item, there's nothing there. And this version 2 has got the frame and the joints for that part of it. So these titles, and you can leave them as untitled or user saved, and it'll just kind of be blank. On this one, I got version 20. You can see a lot of these don't have titles because it was just me working, and there's not a lot to tell me other than kind of the picture of what I was doing in any of those things. And that was just me working for myself, so I kind of knew what I was doing. But since we're working in a shared environment, as much as you can document and communicate what you're doing, people know what version 2 is because I told them and put it in there. So that's going to cover this first video. We talked about using rule number 1 for organization and structure. Anytime I need to go into the front main beam, the timeline is very simple, and I can see the 2 extrusions in the front main beam. When I drilled that hole, it went ahead and added it to this component. Okay. If I activate the front crossbeam, there's a sketch and extrusion. The rear main crossbeam has got some more geometry with it. And then finally the rear crossbeam. One of the things we talked about was using the inspect tool. I can come here and do component color cycle toggling. And anything that's a different color is a different component, as evidenced over here. And even this teal color is here, but if I come and expand, And then this rust color is component 5. So we should name this, and I'll call this the pivot brace. And I'm just making this stuff up. That's not what it's called, but that's what I feel like calling it right now. Okay, so all of these components have got names. When I save things over here in the data panel, the saves have names. The component color cycle toggling will show you which functions go with which joints. It gets a little bit overwhelming at times, so I'll turn it back off and just go back to the gray. But this is going to go have great structure and allow us to really be clear in what we're doing and allow other people to come in and edit and find the different sketches and extrusions of what we're working on. It really allows us to kind of leverage our time, that multiple students can work on the same design in Fusion 360 and know what the other students were working on and what they intended. So that's all for this video. The next video we'll start designing some of the wheel boxes and some of the steering geometry. Thanks.